Okay, looks like we're live. So welcome to the Open Source Security Foundation Vulnerability Disclosures Working Group meeting. It's February 8th, 2021. And welcome everybody. Let me share my screen with the notes and the agenda. So if you, all of you attending today could ungray yourself on the list of participants. I will later on be able to transfer that to the meeting minutes on GitHub. And I noticed we have a few folks who are new on the call. So if you could introduce yourselves and tell us kind of where you're from and what got you interested in our working group.
Hi, this is Dan Middleton. I work at Intel. I've been poking around different parts of OpenSSF, and this is my first time joining today. Saw the note about the white paper and thought I would take a peek in and see what's going on here.
Okay, cool. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alexander Romero, go by Roro. Same sort of story there as well, also with Intel.
Cool, welcome.
Thank you.
So what do you guys do at Intel? I used to work there many years ago.
So I just started about a month ago or so over at the PCERT, trying to deal with kind of the high visibility issues that might come across their desk.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Leitschuh. I work at Gradle Inc. I'm part of this, I'm a security software engineer there. I'm also an open source security researcher. So I have been doing open source security research using CodeQL as part of the GitHub Security Lab. Probably most notably, I was the one that reported the giant Zoom vulnerability in June of 2019, the one that blew up in all the media. And I'm here, I'm also a GitHub star, and I'm here because of the link in the Google blog about this organization and some of the discussions there, so, yeah.
Oh, you mean the Google blog that, like the one with the goals and followed by the OSV announcement? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Cool. So just for the context. All right. So welcome. Is there anyone else who?
I'll go. My name is James Johnson. Let's see, we have a few of us from GitLab. I'm on the vulnerability research team at GitLab, and I've been following the emails and a little bit about what the working group has been doing, but I haven't directly joined myself. And so this is me directly joining and wanting to participate.
Hey, welcome.
Hi, my name is Kevin Ward. I'm from Control Plane. I have a big interest in vulnerability research and vulnerability management, particularly being on the tail end of a DevSecOps when it kind of started to come to fruition as that term, and taking care of vulnerabilities for multiple people and understanding how they'd be, whether they had to be triaged, whether they have to be remediated or just accepted. And I was one person managing like all of that, which was not fun. So very interested to see kind of how this progresses as a group.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? I'm just scrolling the list of attendees. Okay. Sounds like that's all newcomers. I'm actually quite excited that we have so many new folks on the call. So welcome once again. So some of you were kind of drawn by the disclosures white paper that we started to talk about the last time we met, and I definitely want to spend some time trying to organize us again, in working against that goal. But there's one like organizational thing that I wanted to chat to all of you about, and that is the sort of leadership of this working group and the transition. So I've been lucky enough to kind of participate and lead this working group ever since it was formed, still under the Open Source Security Coalition. But recently, I unfortunately had to like reevaluate how much time I can devote to different open source activities. And as you've probably noticed, I wasn't as active in trying to get this group together and moving forward as I would have liked. I thought it's probably like time for me to step down as a lead and pass this to people who have been co-leaders in ever since we kind of formed. And Chris was kind enough to step forward and take over as a group lead. So huge shout out to Chris and Sue. And I think you'll do a terrific job leading this group. For what it's worth, I plan to stay involved as much as possible as a contributor. So I'm not leaving too far. So a round of applause for Chris for stepping up. I think it's really awesome that we have someone who can step up and lead the group.
I'd say a round of applause for you for helping get this whole thing kickstarted and leading us to this point, Marcin. Thank you.
Yes, agree.
Hey, agreed.
Yeah, and as I said, I'm not going anywhere, so I'll still hang around. Alrighty, so probably Chris will take over, logistics and scheduling of all the meetings and all the kind of fun stuff that goes into putting those meetings together. It's not a hard job, but it's also it's been a pleasure. So so that's cool. And are there any questions about that? I'll take that as a no. Okay, so the last time around we kind of started to chat about the white paper, and I think when I originally kind of proposed the idea, just a little recap, I thought about doing something quite comprehensive and building on all the knowledge exchange that was happening here in this working group in those calls for the last few months. But during the discussion we had the last time, it was, I think we arrived at the conclusion that would be, what would be more valuable would be a white paper that's focused on open source maintainers, right? So we wouldn't do it's like an epic 100 pages long thing that covers all the things and standards and workflows in open source vulnerability disclosure, but we would address the need of an open source maintainer that wants to do the right thing when it comes to vulnerability disclosure, but they don't quite know how to do that. And we kind of quickly can discuss that this is probably like the vast majority of open source maintainers. A lot of critical projects can have either like a corporate owner, or there are people from organizations that know how to do this. And this is kind of my experience with, for example, organizations such as OpenJS Foundation, right? There's a bunch of projects under that foundations that in and of themselves have like different vulnerability disclosure stories, but they have this fallback organization that will help if need be. And this is also something that I see is happening, and I kind of helped kickstart some of that in the Node.js community. But I think there's still like a lot missing in terms of like educating open source maintainers how to how to publish a security policy, what that policy should contain, how to accept vulnerability reports, how to release the fixes, and how to disclose vulnerabilities when those fixes are available, how to do coordinated disclosure if that's appropriate and when that is appropriate. And then, if you have a fix, you have a vulnerability, like, do you just put it out there? Do you publish in some sort of machine readable format? So SCA and vuln management kind of vendors can pick it up. Like a lot of those things, I think, is fairly nuanced. And if we could have simple, actionable resource for open source maintainers to read and adopt the practices, I think that would move the needle and that would be progress. Because in this working group, we've had a tremendous amount of information. I think that's mostly living in our meeting notes, and I wanted to transfer it to something that's more discoverable, much more polished, and therefore much more useful. When it comes to coordination, most of the coordination that we're doing is in our repo, but since this is a project in and of itself, it looked like I have enough permissions on the OSSF org on GitHub to actually go and create a project, which I did earlier today. It's bare bones. There's nothing in it, not a single issue, not a single PR. It's just a repo, but we can use it going forward, I think, to just organize ourselves. We can also use, I think, GitHub projects to coordinate our own work in developing the content, and later on probably in the publication process. So the question I have is who's interested in participating, because I think there are going to be a few opportunities to kind of contribute and collaborate. I think the primary one that I'm thinking about is just collaborating on the content and putting it together. But there's we also need people who are going to review that content and do proofreading, and later on putting it into a format that's going to be suitable for publication, and so on and so on. So I expect plenty of opportunity for everyone to kind of chime in and do some work around it.
This is Dave.
Also, go ahead, David. Sorry.
As I say, this is Dave Wheeler. So I'd be willing to help and contribute. It might be helpful for somebody to create at least a first page, especially if you're not going to use Google Docs, but you're going to try this on GitHub. Trying to start with an empty file and trying to merge issues on an empty file is probably not a winning strategy. So you might want to either start with Google Docs or start with somebody actually having something to edit. Second is you mentioned open source projects which have significant corporate backers. There's a very large number of projects where there's one developer, and there's occasional drive-bys.
Yeah, and this is the type of, I think, person we're trying to address the most.
Yeah, I think that's the group that really would be probably most receptive for, here's a short doc, it tells you what to do to get started and what to do when you actually receive an issue. And I'll note that for the CI best practices badge, the main thing that we pressed on was just have a way to report vulnerabilities, because most of these developers don't even have that. There's no way to report vulnerabilities clearly identified. And they won't even do that because they don't know to do that.
Yeah, they don't people, and this was an interesting experience from the Node.js community. People don't even say, it's if you have a security vulnerability, maybe stay away from the public bug tracker, right? It seems like a no-brainer, but it seems to be something that's still worth reiterating.
Just FYI, that is actually controversial. There is a non-trivial number of projects where, full disclosure, we mean it. If it's a vulnerability, you post it publicly. But they at least make it clear. And the problem
Right.
is, I think I wouldn't work that way. And I think most people wouldn't, but it's not clear how they want to work.
I'm still pushing on GitHub to try to get them to be able to make, so I'm a GitHub star, I have a couple of relationships there. I'm still pushing against them to try to get them to get the GitHub advisories to be something that you can open by yourself, right? Like something that you don't need to have an admin open, but you can open it as a security researcher.
I've been working on that for a while. Yay, thank you.
I don't work for GitHub, but I think they are aware of that and might be working on it.
Yeah,
So just to echo what we said last time about the white paper, I think we all kind of decided that there's definitely multiple different opinions about, you know, full disclosure, coordinated disclosure, et cetera, and that when we write the white paper, we should probably just say, you have options A and B, you can read more about them here, but like just lay out what the options are and not necessarily advocate for one or the other. Because like you said, some groups are vehemently in for one or the other. And so not playing that game.
I think
and if someone has an opinion, like they better put it in their security policy. And I think that's the first thing for us to like advocate. It's like, if you expect people to act in a certain way, just make it clear.
I wanted to say I'm glad to participate and help contribute to this project. Secondly, I think this is an opportunity for us we have a couple different efforts within the group where we've talked about personas and pain points. And I think that can help inform the white paper itself and be supplementary resources. And then thirdly, David and I are part of the developer best practices working group within the OpenSSF. And I think that would be a great vehicle once this group decides kind of what we want the guidance to be, is that developer best practices group can help be the mouthpiece and vocalize, this is a good practice. We feel everyone should read this white paper and, you know, consider these guidelines. So I think we've got a lot of opportunity here to get some cross-group synergy and to leverage the existing materials we've been toiling away on for the last couple months.
I think that one thing that's really important to keep in mind, and this is something that Katie Masuris, when I chatted with her, pointed out to me, is disclosure is going to happen, right? It's not going to necessarily happen the way that you control it or the way that you want it to. Like, you need to, you know, the reality is you kind of need to be able to accept it however it's going to come. And like, you know, that's really hard culturally for some organizations. And so like, whatever suggestions that come out of like how, you know, here are the different, like, you know, disclosure practices that you want to enforce on your project. Like, the reality is, I think that needs to be stated up front is like, you're going to get stuff in a variety of different ways. And you need to be okay with that, or, you know, not, but you're going to be fighting a losing battle.
And I think it's incumbent upon this group, when we write this white paper, to adopt the maintainer developer persona. That's who we're writing for, not for a persona that represents our corporations or groups we're from. We're talking about open source developers. These are some options and recommendations we have for everybody. There's a lot of different variability, but don't try to instantiate my Red Hat policy on the whole community, but that is potentially an option.
Is there a current of the working group currently a overall mental mindset around, I know that there's, you know, the idea of responsible disclosure, and like, is that generally accepted as like, what is the current mental state on that across the board, or is there a lot of different ideas currently?
Actually, I would even push back. I don't think the word responsible disclosure should be used. It's coordinated disclosure. Even Microsoft, which coined the term, has recommended don't call it because that implies that that's the only way to do it. I actually encourage coordinated disclosure, and I would be okay with the doc that encouraged coordinated disclosure. But I think we also need to acknowledge that some people don't like that. And I think a little thing of, hey, we recommend X. If you don't like that, then here's a way to do it with Y. Might be a useful thing to do. So I'm okay with the document encouraging coordinated disclosure, but we need to acknowledge that that's not a universal truth, or at least a universally believed.
Yeah, circling back, I think we had a goal to put in resource lists of like, you have options to do X, we're going to talk about Y, but here's your other options, and link them out.
Yeah, I'm just absorbing something that might be helpful in the scoping. I'm hearing on the conversation both potential for white paper that describe resource best practices and the like for operating as a coordinator when you are an open source maintainer, meaning how to receive vulnerabilities from others and how to coordinate throughout the process. It will probably be a multi-party process. As part of that coordination function, you might be also a reporter yourself, especially in a multi-party. But I'm also hearing on this call some discussions on if you find a vulnerability in other people's, other organizations, code, we as a community, the open source community, recommend the following practices as a reporter, and that would definitely go way into this the much harder discussion around full disclosure and the like. So I think separating these two elements would be very useful, especially when it comes to documenting the best practices. That's a distinction that is also apparent in international standard, ISO IEC 29147-3101.
If you get an opportunity, we did a whole bunch of persona work recently, and you're 100% correct. That's how we started dividing it, that we are separating things into distinct personas, and we're focusing on one persona at a time. So yeah, you're 100% correct.
I would just only add one element here. One of the biggest, at least, items we are seeing from an open source discussion on the policy landscape is that, you probably have noticed this as well. There are emergent regulations now seeking to require organizations to have that point of contact. It really is apparent in IoT as a sector and embedded. And there are multiple examples. It's in NIST 259, which is now becoming the backbone of the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act. It's in the UK. It's a global phenomenon. And the question is, how do we document some processes for open source maintainers that might be required under these emerging regulations? Just to add to the previous point, disclosure is going to happen, but now you're actually, there are specific segments and there are specific jurisdictions that are going to require you to at least have that external facing contact. So I think the first issue of combining all the resource on assisting the community with best practices. And one of the things we at Intel might try to do is to get 3111 free. It's I don't know if you're aware, but 29147 and our tiers on the call was made available. The 2014 version was made available because of many efforts of ARC and others. And I think maybe we can try to get also the previous version of 3111 available as well. And that would, instead of paying for that standard, it would be, the prior version of it would be widely available. I think that will really progress our joint understanding of best practices.
The one thing that I also want to communicate here is I've run into a lot of issues around disclosure as a security researcher, running into problems with organizations. So one of the things that exist in a lot of the bug bounty programs and a lot of HackerOne, Bugcrowd, all those ones, usually participation requires accepting the organization's disclosure policy. And so I have been opting to avoid HackerOne and Bugcrowd more and more often and trying to opt for email or forcing the organization into GitHub security advisories, because I don't really feel comfortable accepting their disclosure policy on their what ends up happening is the disclosure policy is if you follow all these rules, including our disclosure policy, then we will not legally pursue you, right? So there's a basically like you're, in scope for our disclosure for disclosing a vulnerability for us without it being like, you having legal proceedings go after you, as long as you conform to all these rules, including our disclosure policy. And that's, at that point, I'm just like, that also, like, the risk of dealing with Bugcrowd and like potentially getting thrown off of Bugcrowd or HackerOne as a security researcher because of, your need to hold your own disclosure policy, right? Use your own disclosure policy. More and more of that has kind of led me to kind of just back away and say, I'm rather use email. I'd rather not. And then if you really want me to, you have to upfront agree that I can use my disclosure policy and that will override your disclosure policy before I'll use your platform to disclose.
This is Reed from HackerOne jumping in here. This has come up as a very small number of cases that I can think of off one hand. But we're always happy in those cases to work with the researcher and work with the organization to find that middle ground that works for both parties. So if that ever is a case, and it's speaking for HackerOne here, but I'm sure Background can do the same thing, is that just reach out to support, and we're happy to help coordinate that. And our goal is basically to make sure the vulnerability gets disclosed and gets fixed. So we understand that there are things that come up, and that some policies have things that people don't want to agree to and such, but we're happy to work with those researchers to hopefully make the experience good for both parties.
So I would just add very quickly, I have some experience with that language. Some of you on the call might know. I would just say one of the things that we can document or we can consider including in the white paper that would assist with some of these issues is just distinction between the bug bounty and a vulnerability disclosure program, which is a very basic distinction, but when it comes to the safe harbor issues that you're just mentioning, Jonathan, academically speaking, that's where there is a lot that nuance comes into play. So actually there are some policy documentations that recommend to have both, right? Because the bug bounty in terms of the scope of the safe harbor and in terms of the language would necessarily be often different than a safe harbor you would include in a vulnerability disclosure program. So that distinction plays out there.
Yeah, you have like they only have a bug bounty program and it's private, right? And so like all of their bug bounty program, and you're like, I don't want to disclose to your bug bounty program. I've run into that a lot of times where you get driven towards the bug bounty program, which has this fixed policy, and you're like, I'm willing to give up the bounty in order to disclose this and have a CVE assigned. Like if that, I'm not going to be silenced by your bug bounty program. Thank you very much.
Right. That's why I think we kind of need to nail down some audience for this white paper, because I think a lot of those considerations are for like bigger projects that have, or just sorry to be blunt, but that care. I'm not sure like how nuanced can we get about the disclosure policy with an individual developer that's just maintaining their own project, right? Probably what we want to do is enable that process to function at all, and for security researchers to be able to disclose at all, and not just chase individual people. And I've kind of have witnessed my fair share of security researchers or people helping them in kind of open source bug bounty programs, just chase people and try to find maintainers. But all of this is kind of very relevant. So what I thought, and this is kind of to get back to David's point, is we should probably start with putting together some sort of like a scope or table of contents for the white paper, and then we would be able to that way we would be able to nail down like which aspects, which elements of the whole process we want to cover, right? Does that sound like a reasonable next step, or do we need to do some more brainstorming around like, okay, which persona, in using the lingo we've been using for the last couple of meetings, which persona and which use cases do we want to address by publishing the white paper?
I mean, I think we pretty much had nailed it down last time. It was going to be a maintainer persona and who was at the bottom of the maturity scale and was like, where do I start? And I mean, for a starting point for our group, that seems like a really good goal to me. And then obviously we want to do more white papers later that build on the different personas and maturity levels. But I mean, unless other people think there's a more valuable one to start with, I think that is a small enough scope.
I think if it's maybe start off the paper with an introduction to the sort of the persona use case, or the like we had defined personas, this introduces the maintainer role. It can also help build build the fundamentals for the rest of the papers as well. So sort of define not necessarily define all the personas, but maybe introduce them in some way.
I think this could be a separate documentation, because imagine that later we have white papers for different personas. Are we going to include all the personas there too? Or if a maintainer goes and reads this white paper, do they really care about learning all the different personas at that moment, or they prefer reading through it and finding out what they need to do?
I don't necessarily think we need to include all of them, but just say that we have defined sort of personas, and this is the maintainer persona. Not necessarily go into deep detail about all of them.
Is there a goal of a higher level sort of? So like, for example, there are some people that really want to dive into licensing, right? But then GitHub also has the choose a license, kind of like high level, like, here's a drop down, here like the high level, like ups and downsides of this particular choice that you've made. Like, I feel like there's some like, especially for the people that are like, I just want to get coding or something like that. Like or like, I don't really want to do a deep dive into this very complicated topic, right? Arguably. Like, can you give me like a high level, like what decision can I make here at a high level, understand the simple implications at like the simplest step, and I can like make that decision and like run with it.
Yeah, I'm fine, for example, with we would recommend coordinated disclosure. Not everyone agrees. Here's some literature, and basically for at least a first version, making it simple as possible, short as possible. And if there's a later version that goes with more options, that's great. I do like the idea of, choose your own adventure if we've got the time to do it. But
yeah,
somebody's got to step up and write the other parts of the adventure.
Yeah, I also think like learning a lesson from like the software industry, like scope creep is real. So we could go like at length exploring different, fine points of the whole process. But I think it's like nailing down a use case and doing it well is probably going to be will make this very valuable resource. That doesn't mean we need to ignore like more advanced issues, because I think there's like potentially we could think of like other types of content that we could publish that will allow people who are more advanced and further in their journey explore those finer points. And like frankly speaking, I think we've had a lot of that kind of content captured in this working group already, which like when we started, like I think I heard from a few of you that like everyone comes with their own perspective, and being here and exchanging experiences was like eye-opening for a lot of people, and I think we could capture that and publish that in some form. And actually, like this is something I also said the last time. It's like we probably didn't have enough of representation from the security research community. So like it's actually only now realized that kind of Jonathan kind of maybe will help us close that gap in terms of like the composition of the group and having all the perspective and all the personas kind of here present at this virtual table, so that everyone like we can get a complete and fair contribution from all the roles.
If there's anybody that knows anybody at the Project Zero Day or the GitHub Security Lab or some of those other labs, it might be appreciated to like reach out if you have any contacts there and say, hey, like, because I mean, I'm happy to offer my insights, but like, there's other people that have been doing this way longer than I have, so.
Yeah, I don't know anyone at Google Project Zero, but I definitely have contacts at the GitHub Security Lab. Yeah, it's a good point.
I'll reach out to Matt Linton at Google to get some GPZ folks at least CC'd.
Katie Masters is also a great resource, but her time is not free. So yeah. She's very, very busy with a lot of different things.
Mo also has so much already published in videos that if we want specific things, I'm sure I can find one of her snippets and reference it, or she'll point me at the YouTube. There's no point in having her reiterate things that she's either published or already recorded.
I missed that name. Who was that?
Katie Mazurs, Kamo.
Thank you.
She has very, very pink hair. You would recognize her.
Okay.
She walks around cons with wings on. She's spectacular. Luda Security is the company that she started.
Cool.
Is there anyone who would like to volunteer to turn this discussion into like a scope of what we want to cover?
I'll repeat what I said last month. If you give me a month to get through the classes my boss signed me up for, yes, but otherwise I am out of time.
And specific to the maintainer finder persona interaction, Crystal and I sat down for several hours and kind of worked through the pain points there, which is, again, it's an artifact in our Git repo. If someone wants to review that and comment and collaborate on it, we'd be great to kind of more fully develop that and identify, maybe we need to have more finder personas. We need to have an academic versus a professional versus a community person, if that's valuable. But we started to catalog that in the pain points documents.
Right. Would it make sense, because we still haven't done it? We still haven't moved content from Google Docs to GitHub. Would it make it easier to do this work if it was on GitHub in one place? Because I think the kind of the value there is not so much in the format itself, but just having it all in one place. Because I
think there's enough initial content now that not going forward, it'll just be adjustments, changes, adds, deletes. So I think that's a great course of action, Marcin. We can convert it to a MD files or whatnot.
Yeah, because what I did, I have a PR open here that uses Jason's persona briefs. Like, it's literally stolen or copied from his slides. So I could merge that.
Open source.
Yeah, so he granted us a permissive license to use those personas. He, by the way, expressed interest in contributing to this white paper, which is great. So what I can do is I can merge this PR, and then we can start documenting those pain points as independent, like, markdown files here, which would be I think a step in a good direction. And here in this disclosures white paper repo, what I can do is I can create an issue later on to kind of kick off the scoping or coming up with a table of contents. And people here on the call, I'll put this into the meeting minutes before publishing them on GitHub. I'll put a link to the issue, and everyone who's interested, you can chime in.
Out of curiosity, so I asked Katie this, like, do you treat somebody who does bug bounty research differently than, like, from her perspective, like, right? Do you treat somebody differently from a bug bounty researcher differently from, like, an academic or security researcher? And her mindset is like they basically operate as the same person. I'm confused what the mentality is here around, like, from a person who's receiving a report, what is the different, like, is your reaction different to these different kinds of people? Like, do you handle the vulnerability differently? What's the, so, I see this kind of as like a useful, like, from a conceptual standpoint in terms of, like, maybe this group capturing this, but from a maintainer's perspective, like, there is an end goal of disclosure, hopefully, in any of these. And, like, you should be bountying any of them or offering, if you have a bounty, right, you shouldn't be like, well, this person's an academic researcher, not a bug bounty hunter. Like, we don't bounty those. Like, I feel like the treatment on the maintainer side in open source or a company receiving these reports is generally the same and should be considered the same, or am I not quite? Yeah. What's the current state there?
Jonathan, so the treatment would be the same. It's more about the drivers, like, it's the person. So the persona is more about the individual's drivers that makes them want to do what they're doing and what behavior they might express. What motivates.
But if this is authored primarily for the developer, does the developer care?
I
Probably not.
Probably not for an intro document, probably not at all. I would observe that developers do care about the more detailed personas because it helps them handle the reports, but not in an intro doc, I don't think.
Yeah,
my opinion.
In my opinion, for this group, if we're focused on the small to mid-size project or developer, just a generic finder persona is useful enough to start. And if we find there are nuances with the different types of researcher personas, it might make sense to add more fidelity, but at least to start with that most basic kind of maturity level 0, 1, just finder researcher, I think is good enough to start. And if we learn more, we can alter course.
Yeah,
If I can quickly,
so too.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think one difference is some people, it's way more important that they get credit. But I don't think for this intro, we need to emphasize, just tell maintainers, unless they tell you otherwise, give credit. It's not fair otherwise.
Yep.
So, as long as we emphasize the give credit part, I don't think we need to go into grand detail. Another common mistake I see is developers not giving credit.
And it sounds like the end goal that you're thinking about for this paper is that it would directly inform this maintainer persona, or this is setting up to something like a best practices effort where you're going to instrument the workflow for creating a repo or something.
Yeah, but I think what we were thinking about is like mainly inform.
And once we have the skeleton up, the framework developed, if somebody has specific subject matter expertise, that could be a supplementary artifact that gets added in. Hey, I represent the bug bounty community, and here's our addition to the core good practices that this group's laid out. Or, I represent suppliers, so I can take my particular perspective and augment the framework, the supplementary materials.
Yeah, so like this, I guess we don't have to capture everything in the release. We can like maintain them online, like an FAQ. We can evolve that's kind of accompanies the white paper, or maintain a knowledge base, or like publish a V2 of the white paper in some time. So I guess what I'm getting at is it's like trying to be perfect and cover everything should not necessarily stand in the way of making progress, because I think having something released is better than having like working for a year towards like a perfect and all-encompassing resource.
The comprehensive personas may well be a very useful exercise and could be used lots of ways, but again, for a first smaller paper, probably don't need that detail.
That's true.
But I could see a lot of use in that, in having that written out, personally at least.
Let me see if I can find this real fast. One of the things, so this is a slight deviation from the topic of personas. Is that okay? Okay. So one of the things that I've run into as an issue quite a bit is, so I had this, like, I've been dealing with this issue with the Apache Foundation vulnerability. One of the things that I kind of like had settled, like realized is, so one of the biggest issues that comes as a result of vulnerability disclosure is a lack of respect one way or the other, right? Like that dynamic and that relationship that plays out between the researcher or the person reporting the vulnerability and the person and the people receiving the report. Because, and I think that like fundamentally one of the the things that is important to understand is, for a security researcher, the easiest thing for them to do is drop an O-Day on Twitter and then hand it to like, SNCSEC or, all these other organizations and say, here, please do disclosure for me, right? Here's the information, it's public, right? But there's a certain level of respect that the person who's disclosing the vulnerability privately is providing, providing to both the users and the maintainers, right? But you know, one of the things that falls apart a lot of the cases is the maintainers not responding to the reporter. Like they're internally having the discussion, but they don't like respond to the reporter, or they don't interact with the reporter, or like they don't give the updates to the reporter. And so what the reporter is feeling like is, hey, like I put all this extra work to disclose to you privately, try to facilitate disclosure, right? Do this, like, you know, go the long way around to, you know, and it's more work for me. And the reporter doesn't feel respected by the maintainers because there's no communication about the vulnerability. There's no discussion. There's no like, hey, we're up, or like even like, hey, like, you know, 3 of us are sick and can't deal with this right now. Like we will get back to you next week, right? Like even the simple stuff. And so I think that as part of this white paper, conveying that, like, you know, treating the person like a human, and also like the reporter like a human, and also like, you know, communicating like updates of like, you know, life has gotten in our ways. Like people can be understanding, but if you just like, you know, don't communicate for a month, 2 months, people get upset, and then they look at their email, they're like, this was dealt with 3 months ago, and like I'm just going to drop this as a no day because it's easier, right? So I think that component of like, I don't know if there's a better word, but respect is the best, you know, kind of way of communicating that need of that back and forth in order for these relationships to be successful.
I think if you could take a look at the reporter persona, we did cover that as a pain point, where the lack of just being updated and kept in the loop, we definitely pointed out as a problem. So it would be really valuable if you could give that a look, for sure.
Yeah, but I think we kind of recognize that the problem is real, and I think I personally would love to see that covered in the white paper, because like sometimes like developers may treat those reports as sort of noise, especially when the impact of the reported vulnerabilities maybe not immediately kind of obvious to someone who's not a security expert. So I think like fostering that that collaborative nature of disclosure, I think would be quite important. Because like oftentimes like maintainers are not security experts, so they might not immediately recognize like what the impact is. So I think it's like kind of building that mutual patience and collaboration is yeah, that's super important. So I would yeah. Go on,
oh, sorry. Yeah, I think one of the really basic things that people could do that we suggested including was just adding a holding statement, like just respond. You know, a lot of people want to respond after they have all the information, and they're kind of waiting to do that, and they don't realize that it's more effective just to respond and say, hey, I'm going to be able to look at this in 2 weeks, like, or whatever your time frame is. Just being upfront about that, and more responding quickly, but you don't have to have all the answers right away.
I think that one of the things that I've run into is the automated response, and like that's like great, okay, your email has been received, but like it's not human. And so it still has that same, like, you know, even though you did respond, right, it's not really a response. I think that communicating that, like, you know, just automation is not enough to, you know, satisfy that, like, okay, we're communicating now. This is not just like me throwing something over a wall.
Yeah, definitely. I think like I'm not a security researcher myself, but I imagine like getting an acknowledgement slightly later would be more valuable than getting it right away from like an automated responder. Just you know, just a hunch though. Yeah, but I would definitely like to see a section in the white paper that covers like what happens in the period where the vulnerability is actually being fixed, right? Because like we talk a lot about reporting. We talk a lot about disclosure after the fix is available, the release is out there, and then what do we do? Or even like debating the sequence of those events is something that causes like heated debates. But what happens in potentially quite a long period of time where someone is actually working on the vulnerability and getting researcher involved in maybe testing some of the fixes and stuff like that. I think that's quite important for us to address.
Yeah, and I think in many cases it's a process of gradual understanding, frankly, for both sides. I mean, the initial thought of the developer is, oh, I'll just do X, and no, that's actually that's a symptom. It's not the underlying problem. Whereas the reporter may not understand the broader context that the developer is working in. So I agree, encouraging some sort of dialogue so that there's a working fix that works within both the application and truly fixes the problem. I think
GitHub security advisors GitHub security advisors are great for this, because not only do they you get the communication back and forth, but there's also like because the private fix is encoded, the pull request of the fix is encoded in that process. The researcher also gets a visibility into the actual fix process and the communication, any pull request, reviews that are going on, all of the discussion that goes on around that. It all becomes you feel involved and it's important, right? Yeah.
We also need to be aware our recommendations need to be tool agnostic. If a particular vendor or project has a great process, we can refer to that. Hey, for an example, look at the GitHub activities, but we represent a larger scope and we need to remain agnostic and neutral in that regard.
Right. I think we can say, for example, and ideally always have two examples. For two different, if you're using GitLab, this is how you could do this. If you're using GitLab, here's how you could do this, whatever.
Right. And if you're using
list,
that was exactly going to be my point. We can always refer back to Linux type projects where you're actually not using GitHub, but the email flow.
I think that the two other things that are broken down here around disclosures that I've run into are one that I've run into with Google, where they didn't run the CVE disclosure body by me, and it ended up being completely wrong. So they published a CVE that completely missed the mark in terms of actually accurately describing the vulnerability and the way that you mitigated it. And then the other one that I've seen is not involving not pointing the security researcher at the commits that actually fix it, to let them look at them and say these are these good or not. And those are the two big ones that I've run into recently.
Yeah, I think definitely as part of our good practice recommendation, we want to talk about collaborating with the researcher or people within the community on the fix, so everybody has visibility into that throughout the process. They understand what that final product is going to look like.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's important, and this is very weird because I just communicated you want to do that, but the other part of it is that there needs it's weird because there's also no expectation of that happening too, right? It's here it is if you want it, but we because it's open source, right? You can't rely upon those things happening as a because the researcher has given you something, unfortunately it's dropped a vulnerability in your lab, right? And so great, if they want to collaborate, awesome. If they just drop the ball on you, how do you deal with that?
Oh, I care about the maintainers in this group. It's great that there are researchers and they have concerns. The point of this foundation is to support open source development. So I would like to recommend to developers, it's a great practice if you collaborate on the final fix. Now, if we want to, again, spin off something focused on researchers, if you're collaborating with a bad maintainer, here's some things you can try or some recourse. That's great. I don't know that that should be the tight focus of us thinking about these external personas. I want to focus on the developer maintainer because that's the advice. That's who I have control over. That's the community I live in, and I want to help them be successful. And if a vendor or a researcher bug bounty person gets benefit out of that and can collaborate, great, but I care about the developer.
Grope, I do think it's important to note that if a researcher, talks with a maintainer and a maintainer won't do anything after a period of time, I think it's fair for both the researcher and the developer to understand that the next step is public disclosure and the end. And I think that can help both parties and the users, frankly, as well. which is
Everybody understands what can happen. I agree. Yeah.
right. So what's the next step? We only have a few minutes left.
Right. So the next step is I think I will create that issue in the white paper repo, so we could continue the discussion about the scope, because like before we go into actual content development, I think it's kind of necessary for us to agree on the scope. And I think as a part of that process, we're gonna identify a bunch of things that we think are important, but the white paper is not the right place for them. And I would like to see those things like documented somewhere. Like the things that we explicitly left out of scope. So later on, we could, like, after the white paper has been published, we can get back to them and see what we can do with them. Yeah, backlog is the right technical term for that. Alrighty, so I'm gonna